Robert Yowell is a human spaceflight expert with over 30 years' experience in the field. In recent years, Robert has helped out in Hollywood, acting as a technical consultant for films such as Ad Astra and Lucy in the Sky. Today, we're going to be talking about his latest work on Disney Plus's remake of the iconic astronaut film The Right Stuff, based on Tom Wolfe's book of the same name. Both the 1983 original film and this new series follow the trials of NASA's first ever astronaut class, known as the Mercury 7, due to their participation on Project Mercury. Between 1958 and 1963, Project Mercury developed and then launched the first ever US spacecraft capable of supporting a single human, laying the groundwork for all of NASA's future space missions. So, Robert, what was your role in the series?
Well, I was, as you mentioned already, a consultant for the two films you mentioned. And as word gets around in this business, the producers heard about my background and thought I would be a great match for this series. So as a technical consultant, I work really close with the writers, the directors, the actors, set designers, costume, you name it, just to ensure the authenticity of everything that you're going to see on the screen.
Were there any areas that you particularly contributed to?
Well, certainly what you're going to see in this series, which, by the way, is going to go into much deeper technical insight than the film ever did. You're going to see for the first time depicted in detail the Mercury Control Center. So for Project Mercury, the control center was located in Florida as opposed to Houston later on, that I'm sure most are familiar with. And that early control center there in the early 1960s was quite primitive by today's standards. However, there were using a few pieces of equipment, which in fact I operated as a flight controller and mission control in the 90s for the space shuttle program. For instance, something called a strip chart recorder. So as opposed to seeing data from a spacecraft with numerical digital numbers, one would have to look at a piece of paper that is being moved along on a drum, and then you have a pen with a needle producing sort of a graph representation of the data. Well, that was really the primary means by which the Mercury flight controllers were looking at data from the Mercury spacecraft. So this is something that I explained to the props people, again, the actors, everyone involved, because frankly, I think today most people would not know what on earth a strip chart recorder is. So I think that was one piece I can point to that I provided some great help to the production. You're going to see certainly in the later episodes when we actually show Shepard's flight. Some really marvelous detail portrayed there because there were a few things that occurred during his flight which were unexpected. The Mercury capsule had a periscope, which was the astronaut's primary view of the Earth. The first spacecraft that was flown by Shepard did not have the same larger pilot's window that Gus Grissom and the following astronauts used. So in using that periscope, there was a little anomaly there that you'll see in that episode, which Shepard sort of just had to live with for the short duration of his flight. But I helped with the description and the overall look of that scene by working with the CGI folks, again, with the director and even with the actor on that one.
Now, you might be a bit biased on this one, but how accurate do you think the series is to the way things were during the Mercury missions?
Oh, I think it's tremendously accurate, and really, by comparison, the film is great. It stands the test of time, but in some ways isn't all 100% accurate by comparison. But that's fine. It did well to bring the spirit of Tom Wolfe's book to life. What we're doing here in this series is taking it to another level, to a much higher level of authenticity. And frankly, with today's technology, with CGI, we're able to do things that they couldn't do in 1983 for the film. So from that perspective, I think it's very true to life. And I think because of what we're focusing on these episodes, which, again, you didn't have time to focus in a 2.5 or 3 hour film, the viewers are going to see some fantastic depictions of detail that have never before been shown, at least in a dramatic sense, on screen before.
So you worked on films before. How different was this experience to those previous times?
This was my first opportunity working on a television series. So having worked 2 feature films and going to see this production, what really was interesting for me is the fact that really you had as many, if not more, production folks involved in making a TV series than you did with a high budget feature film. So perhaps for me that was eye-opening.
Your background is in much more modern spaceflight, the space shuttle and so on. Looking back at these historical space flights, which are Mercury's from the very, very earliest era of human spaceflight, was there anything that really surprised you?
Well, certainly what's not so much surprising, maybe shocking is the word, is how primitive the technology was at the time, and the incredible fortune that we had of many, many successes, given the fact that, as an example, in the case of the flight controllers, they had so little insight into what was happening on the vehicle. They heavily, heavily relied literally on the voice of the astronaut to convey what was happening. Because unlike the space shuttle, for instance, where we had tens of thousands of individual data inputs to look at in any given second, I believe the Mercury capsule only had about 100 or so parameters that the ground could look at in real time. So just on that point alone, it's really amazing that we were able to have the successes we had. Not to mention the fact that there was no internet, of course, in 1961. Many of the remote sites around the world that were supporting the Mercury, the later orbital Mercury flights, had no ability to provide live voice back to Florida. In some cases, they had to teletype, literally sending little telegrams back to Florida to convey the information that they had just seen as the capsule passed over Kano, Nigeria, for instance, or some of the other remote sites, particularly in Africa.
And given all of those, I suppose hardships is the word, would you have still liked to have been in the control room back then?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And certainly later in the Apollo era, for sure. I was privileged enough to have worked still in that very room in Houston where we controlled the Apollo missions. We were still using it for the space shuttle program in the 90s, believe it or not. But to have been there right at the start of Mercury would have been a tremendous privilege.
Earlier, you mentioned how primitive some of the technology was on Mercury. And there's one scene I remember from the trailer, it really struck out for me, which was when the astronauts are walking around that Mercury capsule. It's barely taller than they are, and it looks like it's been riveted together from an old shed. Were these things really as fragile as they looked?
Well, yes, they were. They were very, very simple design, and not a single computer, obviously, to be found on board, because back in those days, computers were the size of your apartment. So, yeah, the capsules were hand built. Of course, they were hand wired. If you have the opportunity to visit the United States and see one of the Mercury capsules on display, whether it's at the Smithsonian Institution or one of the other museums, take a look inside and look at all the wire bundles behind the control panel, just all over the place. It was not this perfectly streamlined, clean as a whistle capsule like you saw this year with the SpaceX Dragon. It certainly was crude, but it did its job. It was designed to keep, later on, to keep an astronaut alive in space for one day. That's it. For the purpose of Shepard's flight, of course, it just had to keep him alive for 15 minutes. Mm-hmm. So it did its job, and remarkable as it is when you look at it today.
And how does that Mercury capsule compare to today's more modern spacecraft?
A 1960 Triumph Spitfire to a 2020 Aston Martin. Okay, that's probably the best analogy I could give you. The amount of computing power on board the SpaceX Dragon is remarkable, and that's why it can perform practically autonomously for an entire orbital mission. That simply would not have been possible with a Mercury capsule. A Mercury capsule had, if you will, a pre-programmed trajectory, at least for the suborbital missions. But it was as if you were just riding on a roller coaster rail for 15 minutes. You didn't really have much capability to move the capsule outside of a trajectory, if you will, like you could today with a modern spacecraft. It's really no comparison. You're talking about tremendous amounts of safety that has been included now into modern spacecraft that didn't exist for Mercury either. The launch escape tower on the Mercury capsule was probably the biggest safety piece it had. There was no ejection seat. There was really no easy way otherwise for an astronaut to get out of harm's way, other than that launch escape tower, which would have taken the capsule off of the rocket had something really bad had happened in the first few minutes of flight.
There's been something of a run of astronaut films and TV series in recent years, specifically about astronauts and not just space. Two of them you worked on, but we've also had things like Gravity and Space Force and First Man. What do you think's caused this resurgence in interest?
Well, I think a lot of it can be attributed to the vast private enterprises now going on between Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, Richard Branson. It's now bringing space flight closer to the grasp of everyday people. Let's say for now, at least to not everyday people, the billionaires, but eventually it will be everyday people who will have the opportunity to have their own Alan Shepard flight, if you will, because essentially what Richard Branson is doing with Virgin Galactic is a modern way of reproducing the suborbital flight of Alan Shepard. So today, for $250,000, you could do that. And I think this great new enterprise is igniting the public's interest again, and I think Hollywood is answering the call.
Shortly before we recorded this interview, NASA had announced their plans to return to the moon with the Artemis mission and how they were going to go about doing that. We've also had SpaceX complete their first successful crew test, and it looks like Boeing isn't far behind. Given these advancements, I think it's really interesting to look back at these early eras of spaceflight, the beginnings of NASA's plans in space, such as Mercury, and looking about what they ultimately hoped to achieve with exploring space. Do you think those goals that they have back then have been met, or is there still more left to do?
Well, I think for sure, as far as Earth orbital flight, we've reached it, which is a tremendous testament to the last 60 years, for sure. We have a long way to go before lunar flight and Mars missions are as routine, but we'll get there eventually. But yes, absolutely. I think the Dragon mission this year, which was of course orbital, so you could say it was the modern recreation of John Glenn's flight. Well, it proves how far we've come in technology, and it also, I think, gives us a real pause to look back at Mercury and just, again, marvel at how they started with a blank sheet of paper, not just from the spacecraft side, but again, from the mission control aspect, from how do you set aside a list of flight rules to implement and have a flight director who would implement those rules and say, we must end the mission now and get the astronaut back. All of these things didn't exist even 2 years before Alan Shepard's flight. And then they came to life thanks to men like Christopher Kraft, who you're going to see portrayed in the series as the first flight director for NASA. So the events of today are a real wonderful contrast for us to look back to the history that will be portrayed in the series.
Are there any other space stories that you'd really like to be involved with telling?
Sorry, I was just going to say, well, I would absolutely want to be involved in something that talks about the first space shuttle mission, because really that hasn't been, in my view, well dramatized or described before. And I think the story of how John Young and Bob Crippen in 1981 flew the space shuttle for the first time, literally before it had ever flown at all, is tremendous. Because, mind you, prior to the space shuttle, just like with Mercury, every American spacecraft had flown without astronauts prior to putting them in. But that was not the case for the space shuttle.
So having looked back on the past, are you excited to find out what's coming next in the future of human spaceflight?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. When I joined NASA in 1989, it happened to coincide with the week that we were celebrating the 20th anniversary of the Apollo 11 mission. And if you recall, in July of 89, then President Bush made this announcement that we were going to go back to the moon with astronauts. We're going to go on to Mars. And at that time, there was talk that would happen, sometime in the early 21st century. Well, here we are. We haven't done it yet. And been waiting all these years to see it happen. So I am really, really hoping that we do get back to the moon soon, and not too much after that, see the first astronauts land on Mars.
Well, I think that is a lovely sentiment to end on. Thank you very much, Robert, for taking the time to talk to us today.
Absolutely, my pleasure, and just really excited about the series and hope your viewers enjoy it.
If all of that has sparked your interest to find out more about the Mercury project and the astronauts that flew within it, then you can watch the new series of The Right Stuff out on Disney Plus now.